So now that we've done a deep dive on Sun and Moon, X and Y, and Black and White, today we take the next step and cover Generation 4. As with every deep dive, the goal of this video isn't to rehash well-known topics. Instead, we're focusing on the lesser-known details, the details that add so much to the history of Diamond and Pearl. So without further ado, let's dive right in, starting with a list of scrapped features from the Sinnoh games. With Diamond and Pearl being the first mainline games on the DS, Game Freak had the opportunity to rework the core mechanics of the series. The addition of a second screen and stylus opened up a world of possibilities. And internally, there was a flood of creative ideas on how to make full use of the DS hardware. One of the more interactive concepts involved using the stylus to trigger Pokemon encounters. Instead of just the traditional way, players would be able to stand in front of a tree facing it, then physically tap the tree with the stylus to knock Pokemon down, causing them to fall and initiating a battle. A similar feature was planned for fishing too. By standing near water tiles and tapping the water with the stylus, the fishing rod would cast in real time, reacting in conjunction with the stylus. The encounter rate would reportedly change depending on how the rod was cast. To me, these mechanics make it sound like the primary gameplay would happen on the bottom screen, which was a common feature for early DS titles. I wonder when they fully decided on shifting the primary gameplay to the top screen. One of the more unique ideas was a Pokemon drawing and coloring mode, a minigame tied to a special in-game location similar to an art classroom. Players could draw and color Pokemon designs using the stylus, and the finished artwork could be saved as PC wallpapers. Game Freak wanted this to invoke nostalgia, treating this feature like a sketchbook of past drawings that players could revisit. It's a fascinating concept, and perfect for the DS. So perfect that while the feature was ultimately cut, the concept did later evolve into Pokemon Art Academy for the 3DS. Though I would have loved to get a taste of this concept in the mainline Generation 4 games, with some kind of art feature. Writing was set to be a big feature in the game too. While you can technically write on your trainer card in the final game, the concept here was that writing text on the screen would be recognized by the game and converted into in-game text. This way you could write self-introductions, emails, simple sentences, and so on. Writing would be baked into the gameplay itself. It sounds like a creative idea, and I wish we could have seen how Game Freak would have executed it. A stylus-based whack-a-mole minigame featuring Diglett was in the works too. Players would tap Diglett as they popped up, while a Cubone would swing a club to hit them. The game was designed for online competition too, likely letting players challenge each other for high scores. Game Freak also considered using the second screen as an interactive battle display. The bottom screen would show your battle as usual, but the top screen would provide detailed status information on your opponent's team. If the opponent had multiple Pokemon, players could flip through information like HP, status conditions, and possibly even their types. It suggests to me that all of the battles would be structured on the bottom screen, along with all of the moves, battle UI, and etc., while the top screen would have acted as a battle handbook. A much bigger feature was the dynamic map system. The idea was that Sinnoh's environment would shift in real time based on the in-game clock. Water levels in ponds and rivers would rise and fall, revealing hidden caves or blocking certain paths at different times of the day. Like waterfalls might cover entrances during the morning, but reveal hidden areas by nighttime, making Sinnoh a constantly changing layout that players would need to adapt to. On top of this, a more diverse weather system was planned too, and players would have to use a Pokénav-like device to check weather patterns across different routes. This would be a way to catch rare Pokemon too. Since Diamond and Pearl introduced 3D elements to Pokemon's world design, Game Freak considered adding expressive Pokemon animations that would change based on their current status. This could have included unique animations for poisoned or paralyzed Pokemon, for example. Additionally, a snowball puzzle mechanic was considered for snowy areas. Players would have been able to push snow to create snowballs, and at a certain size, it could be used to activate switches, likely as part of a gym or overworld puzzle. And surprisingly, a ski mechanic was also planned for Generation 4. Some of you might remember the scrapped skiing mechanic from the X and Y video. Well, it seems Game Freak wanted to add some sort of skiing mechanic for multiple generations. It's easy to imagine skiing being used to traverse Route 217, though I prefer how it is in the final game and having to trek the whole route. Game Freak tossed around plenty of ideas for Generation 4, some of which actually made it into Diamond and Pearl. Ideas like being able to dash anywhere, or being able to sign the trainer cards with a stylus, or even following Pokemon animations becoming a standard. But then there's ideas that wouldn't see the light of day until years later. For example, a proposal to interact with caught Pokemon using the stylus was tossed around, which is essentially a developer calling a rough blueprint for Pokemon Amie, which didn't appear until X and Y, nearly a decade later. there was also an idea for the gym leaders to compete against each other alongside the player. Rather than just defeating each gym in order, there would be a ranking system amongst trainers in Sinnoh. Points could be raised and lowered, and the top 5 would make up the champion and the Elite 4. I'm sure this would extend beyond just the gym leaders, but the idea here was that even the gym leaders would have rivals, and there would be a display showing who they were currently competing with. Almost like everyone would be assigned a partner to rival against in this competition. Another concept suggested that player choices would shape the world. Like if you trained a specific type frequently, say ground type Pokemon, then the ground type gym leader could take you on as their apprentice, letting you boost the potential of your ground Pokemon. And this is gonna blow your mind, but the idea for a gym building feature was also considered for Diamond and Pearl. Including the Kalos and Alola games, this means Game Freak has considered a gym creation system across 3 different generations, each iteration being closer to becoming a real feature. However, the Sinnoh iteration was particularly fleshed out, expanding on the secret base concept from Hoenn. NPC challengers or online players would come and challenge you, and defeating them earned the player money, which could be used to expand the gym and customize the gym's layout. You could invite your favorite stray trainers to be gym trainers, and you would get a prize for every win they made. But if they lost, your popularity could drop, in which case the gym trainer could possibly leave you. The feature would have you open a gym in your starting town, which is Twinleaf Town, and the feature didn't stop at the gym itself, as you'd be able to develop your starting town. With some grinding, a shop would eventually open in the town, and you'd be able to scale all the way up to a department store. It's clear this idea was fully thought out, but ultimately cut. Given that Game Freak has revisited the idea of a gym building feature multiple times, it gives me hope that it will finally make it into a future Pokemon game. Another intriguing idea suggests that Game Freak planned a separate mode or difficulty setting. Early documents imply a new Game Plus-like mode, allowing players to restart the game with items they had previously acquired. There were also different settings tailored for different player levels, ranging from beginners to veteran players. While Generation 5 later introduced a form of difficulty selection, it seems this feature was already on Game Freak's radar during Generation 4's development. The idea for some kind of ziplining mechanic was also considered for the game too, taking advantage of the DS's 3D elements. Players would latch onto ziplines using the A button to travel between platforms at different altitudes. This mechanic was primarily designed for dungeon-like areas, adding verticality to exploration. There was an idea that dropping in between platforms would let you fall to a different level, like we've seen with previous games. I quickly want to add in some details about Heart Gold and Soul Silver. There's no doubt that Heart Gold and Soul Silver are among the most complete Pokemon games, successfully enhancing Generation 2 while staying faithful to the originals. However, there were some notable design changes, like the beta bottom screen menu design, which I think looks better than the final product. I just much prefer the designs of the icons and how they're laid out, though it's not that different from the final product, so it's not a big deal. The gyms in Heart Gold and Soul Silver were supposed to have a distinctive wing-like exterior, and an emblem design reflecting its type, like the Bug-type gym having a bug emblem, the Flying-type gym having wings, and so on. It's a subtle change, and it's unclear why Game Freak decided to cut this detail. One cool find I want to highlight are these beta Sinnoh Town designs in the Generation 3 Tileset. It's such a no-brainer that Game Freak would conceptualize parts of a region in the pre-existing engine, yet it's so fascinating to actually see this part of a development process. Regarding Jubilife City, Jubilife City's structure was already well defined, and a lot of the details of the buildings are intact, like the trainer school being in the same location, as well as the TV station and the Poketch Company building, which is listed as a corporation in the beta map. Even small details like the signs around Jubilife and the fountain were placed exactly as they appear in the finished game, even the tree next to the fountain. However, there are quite a few differences, like for example, the Pokemon Center being moved closer to the entrance of the city, or this entire southern western section of the map being changed. The southern west part of the map definitely went through the most changes throughout development, and the section also seemed more accessible in the beta. The way the huge building structure around the enterable buildings kinda remind me of how Goldenrod City was laid out, and despite not having any labels, I wonder if there was originally a gym planned for Jubilife City. A location labeled FS is placed even closer to the entrance of the city, but in the final game, the spot became a generic house. Florama Town's layout remained nearly identical from beta to final. However, one development note stands out. It mentions a specific terrain type for planting nuts amongst the flowers. I wonder if this means Florama Town would have had a focus on a farming mechanic of some sort. I wish we knew more. On the other hand, Snowpoint City's beta design looks vastly different to the final version. For the most part, the dimensions of the city seem to be the exact same, but as you can see, it's structured very differently. Like in the final version, there are shipping containers and a port towards the south of the city, but in the beta version, the shipping port was placed towards the right side of the city. The general path was very different too. The gym being much further away from the entrance compared to the final game, along with another FS building and a house. The final Snowpoint City has 2 houses and a Pokemon, so I'm assuming the FS building is a Pokemon, and the final version added an extra house. There's also this open space towards the north of the city, suggesting that there would be another area above that would likely lead to Snowpoint Temple, showing us that it originally wasn't a part of the same map. The design is nice, but the final version of Snowpoint is shaped like a snowflake, and I prefer that way more. Speaking of that port towards the right side of Snowpoint City, this detail goes hand in hand with the next scrap detail of this beta Sinnoh map. This map suggests that we would have had extra water routes, but it's easy to see why they were cut, as they were pretty long stretches of water. I'm personally a fan of Hoenn's design, so I wouldn't have minded the addition of these water routes. Perhaps the decision to cut these routes influenced the change in design for Snowpoint City, which seemed to have a surfing route pointing towards the east. An early story pitch for Pokemon Diamond and Pearl suggests that the setting was designed around the theme of balance. The Sinnoh region itself would have been split into 2 distinct halves. The western side focused on artificial elements, embracing new DS features to showcase technological advancements, whereas the eastern side was designed to be a natural landscape, possibly emphasizing traditional Pokemon wilderness. The mountain range in the middle would have split the 2 sides of a region, which is interesting because Mount Coronet is still present in the final game. Sinnoh would have been portrayed as a utopia world, tainted by human foolishness and ignoring the balance. The player's journey would have involved understanding both sides, preserving nature while also recognizing the need for progress, and correcting the balance. As we saw in the Generation 5 pitch, Game Freak viewed the Sinnoh games as the culmination of a Pokemon series up to that point, and the ultimate Pokemon games. And you can really tell from the development that they had this mindset when creating the games, like how deeply they tied together the legendary Pokemon lore. Many of you have already seen this infamous chart floating around online, a sheet connecting every legendary Pokemon from generations 1 to 4, with Dialga, Palkia and Arceus in the middle. This sheet is a thorough breakdown, tying in box art legendaries to mythical Pokemon, to even pseudo-legendaries like Gyarados, Tyranitar and Dragonite. What's crazy is that while we had no mention of this lore in the games, this exact graphic did appear during the Sinnoh Ruins event, just without any labels. I find it so fascinating that Game Freak included such an obscure detail about the Pokemon world that only Game Freak developers would understand. Perhaps at some point they intended to go more in depth with the legendary Pokemon lore, but they scaled back the idea and decided against it. On the topic of a Sinnoh Ruins event, I want to share a pretty insane theory I have regarding it. It could either be spot on or a complete miss. So the Sinnoh Ruins event is one of the most spookiest and mysterious sequences in the Pokemon series, as you get to see Arceus create a Pokemon egg. A number of real-world images flash on screen, something we've never seen in the Pokemon games. Now if you've watched the rest of the deep dive videos, you might wonder why these images feel a bit familiar now. Remember the pitch document for Generation 5? The square pixely real-world images used as mock-ups throughout the document? Well, what if the images in the Sinnoh Ruins event were concept images from the Generation 4 pitch document? This would be an insane way of breaking the fourth wall in explaining how Pokemon eggs are created, and it would only be a reference that Game Freak would understand. If this theory is correct, we might have just solved one of Pokemon's biggest mysteries. Straying into the gameplay side of lore, we have to talk about the Adamant and Lustrous Orb, which were originally supposed to unlock space and time-based moves respectively, instead of just boosting Dragon, Steel and Water-type moves like they did in the final game. I also want to bring up Luca's character profile, which reveals he is from the Hoenn region. I think it's worth noting that in Oras, there's a sequence where Luca washes up on Hoenn's coastline after a shipwreck. This directly ties back to his original character profile, making it seem like Game Freak deliberately planned his Hoenn origins when developing Generation 4 and the Hoenn remakes. Out of all the deep dives we've done, Generation 4 might have the least amount of scrapped Pokemon. Most of what was removed here were just early designs of existing Pokemon, but a notable cut was a pre-evolution for Vulpix, which was fully designed and completed. However, for unknown reasons, the Vulpix pre-evolution was scrapped at the last minute. Previously, we also learned that Diamond and Pearl were supposed to have an extensive gender difference system, I don't know how I feel about it, and I can only imagine it'd be a nightmare for people working on the anime, so I'm glad this feature was largely scrapped. The final version just has minor differences between a couple Pokemon, and that's a much better approach in my opinion. And with that, we've covered pretty much all of the scrapped content from Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. If you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you in the next one.